The manifest was wrong. Arbitrator Veskalin noticed it the way one notices a splinter, not pain exactly, but wrongness, a small friction against expectation. She was reviewing cargo declarations in the secondary docking registry of Station Meridian 7 when the entry appeared. A Terran bulk freighter, Constance Mary Asterisk, registered as hauling agricultural processing equipment to the outer colonies. 43,000 metric tons of soybeans listed as secondary cargo. The ship had been in dock for 11 hours. It had not unloaded a single container. Veskalin stared at the entry for a long moment, her dorsal filaments cycling through the unconscious color shift that her species associated with unease. Then she looked out through the registry window at the docking arms below, where 17 other Terran freighters sat dark and quiet in their berths, each with valid manifests, each with legitimate transit authorization, each completely still. None of them were unloading. She did not yet understand what she was looking at, but something in the architecture of those 17 ships, the specific angle of their positioning, the particular way they had requested berths on the asterisk same side of the station, made the filaments along her spine go the color of deep water. She filed a routine inquiry. She did not escalate it. That decision would later be entered into the Council's official record as the first human victory of the Meridian campaign, logged not as a battle, not as a fleet engagement, but as 11 hours of a freight ship sitting quietly in a docking berth while a bureaucrat looked at the wrong column of numbers. 3 weeks earlier, the vote had been unanimous. That almost never happened. The Galactic Governance Council comprised 41 member species, each with competing trade interests, territorial anxieties, and centuries of accumulated grievance. Unanimity was, in the Council's own internal documentation, described as a statistical anomaly requiring independent verification before ratification. They had reached it only twice in the previous 400 years. This was the third time. The resolution was straightforward in its language, if not in its implications, recognizing the unacceptable destabilization caused by Terran naval expansion. The Council hereby authorizes the immediate impoundment of all registered Terran warship-class vessels, pending review of humanity's compliance status under the Meridian Accords. 104 Terran warships, every destroyer, every carrier, every gunship and frigate and patrol corvette that humanity had spent 60 years building, impounded at Council-designated anchorages, surrounded by joint enforcement fleets, locked behind credentials that only Council arbitrators could authorize. The human ambassador, a small woman named Sierra Danton, had sat through the reading of the resolution without moving. When the final vote tally was announced, she looked at the floor for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "All right." That was it. No formal objection, no appeal to precedent, no dramatic speech. The Council had expected outrage. They had prepared response protocols for human escalation, had prepositioned enforcement vessels, had drafted 3 separate emergency amendments to address the most likely forms of Terran resistance. The lead arbitrator, High Executor Than Vorel, had personally reviewed all 41 member species security forecasts. Every projection modeled human reaction as some variation of confrontation. Instead, all right. Than Vorel had watched Ambassador Danton walk out of the chamber and felt his secondary hearts do something he could not immediately name. The warships were collected over the following 9 days without incident. Human crews complied. Boarding parties found no sabotage, no hidden weapons, no coded transmissions. The ships were exactly what they appeared to be, military vessels, now stripped of purpose, sitting dark at Council anchorages while humanity's naval capability effectively ceased to exist. The Council's military analysts submitted a unified assessment, Terran strategic capacity reduced to negligible, compliance confirmed, threat index revised downward. Voral had signed the assessment. He had also, for reasons he could not fully articulate to his staff, kept the file open on his terminal. Something about the phrasing of Danton's response. 2 words, the specific flatness of her voice when she said them. All right. Not asterisk, we accept asterisk. Not we comply. Not even we object under protest. All right. Like a human acknowledging that the weather had changed. Like a person nodding that a road was closed and already thinking about a different road. He filed a secondary inquiry with the Intelligence Division, flagging no specific threat, citing only behavioral anomaly, human diplomatic response, requires contextual review. The Intelligence Division acknowledged receipt. They did not escalate it. The thing about Terran freight vessels was that nobody had ever really looked at them. This was not negligence on the Council's part, it was logic. Warships warranted scrutiny. Warships had weapons, armor, military-grade drive systems, tactical computing arrays. Warships were the instrument of national power made physically real, and the Council had learned, across centuries of interspecies governance, to watch the instruments. Freight vessels moved goods. They were slow, ungainly, unglamorous. They traveled commercial corridors under commercial transponders and submitted to commercial inspections performed by commercial port authorities. They smelled like whatever they were carrying. They broke down with statistically predictable frequency and required expensive maintenance, and their crews complained constantly about pay schedules and jump drive recalibration costs. Nobody built military strategy around freight vessels. It simply was not done. The physical parameters alone made it irrational, cargo bays designed for maximum volume, not maneuverability, hulls optimized for load-bearing stress rather than kinetic impact, drive systems tuned for fuel efficiency across long transits rather than the burst acceleration a combat situation demanded. A freight vessel in a battle was a liability. Every civilization that had ever achieved spaceflight understood this. The Council had reviewed Terran freight tonnage as part of the asset assessment phase prior to the resolution vote. The numbers were enormous. Humanity operated somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 commercial freight vessels, depending on how one classified various hybrid purpose craft. The assessment analysts had noted the numbers and moved on. Fleet tonnage, not warship tonnage, irrelevant category. On station Meridian 7, 17 freighters sat in their berths and did not unload their cargo. In the Cathara commercial corridor, 22 Terran bulk haulers were running what their transponders identified as a standard colonial resupply circuit. The same circuit they had run, according to their logs, for the previous 3 years. In the debris field around the Yalith relay point, a Terran salvage vessel called the Asterisk Old Business was doing what salvage vessels did, which was to say it was moving slowly through scattered wreckage, and if its course happened to bring it within 400 kilometers of the Council's primary communication relay in that sector, well, debris fields were unpredictable environments. And in a pressurized maintenance hangar on the human colony world of Caro Station, a woman named Lieutenant Kale Oren, formerly of the Terran destroyer Resolute Asterisk, now without a ship, was lying on her back underneath a freight engine block the size of a small apartment, with a wrench in one hand and a problem she could not quite solve. "It won't seat," she said, to the pair of boots visible beside the engine housing. "Try rotating it 40 degrees counterclockwise before you push." The boots belonged to Chief Ramos, who had served with her on the Resolute Asterisk for 6 years before the Council came and took the ship away. "I know how engines work, Chief." "I know you know. I'm telling you what's different about this Asterisk engine." A pause, the sound of metal shifting. "Oh," she said, that's not how engines are supposed to work." "No," Ramos agreed, "it's not." She rotated the coupling 40 degrees counterclockwise, pushed, and felt it click into place with a solidity that was slightly disturbing for reasons she couldn't immediately articulate. Then she slid out from under the engine block and looked at what she was actually lying next to, really looked at it and said, "Chief, this isn't a cargo bay." "No. This whole freighter, this has never been a cargo freighter." Ramos was quiet for a moment. "It was once. Before the retrofit." He glanced toward the hangar door, a reflex, the look of someone who had learned to check whether they were being overheard. "You want the full briefing." She looked at the engine block. She looked at the hangar around them, the scale of it, the other shapes under tarps that she had been carefully not examining since she arrived. She looked at the manifest on the wall, which listed the ship as a bulk agricultural hauler registered out of Cairo Station, third-generation family-operated, 12 years of transit logs. "All right," Ambassador Danton had said. Kale thought she was beginning to understand what that meant. "Yeah," she said, "I want the full briefing." The translation didn't quite capture it. This was the problem that Veskalin kept returning to as she compiled her report. She had now flagged the behavior of the 17 freighters to her supervisors, who had flagged it upward, and somewhere in the chain of upward flagging, it had reached an analyst who actually knew something about human psychology, and that analyst had sent back 3 words: "Check the phrase." She pulled Ambassador Danton's statement from the council chamber recording. The audio was clear, the translation algorithm well-calibrated, all right, unambiguous. Except, Veskalin had been studying human communication for 4 years, longer than almost any non-human arbitrator in the council system, and she had learned, slowly and with great difficulty, that humans operated a secondary communication layer that existed almost entirely below the formal register. A substrate of implication, context, and loaded silence that their translation algorithms consistently failed to process correctly. She ran the phrase through an extended semantic analysis. She checked contemporary human linguistic databases. She found a cultural note buried in a Terran anthropological submission from 11 years ago, flagged as low priority, never acted on. The phrase "all right" in human communication functions not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement of new information requiring integration. It does not signal agreement, compliance, or submission. In contexts of adversarial interaction, particularly among humans with military or strategic backgrounds, the phrase more accurately translates as, "I have received the new parameters. I am now recalculating." Veskalin read that 3 times. Then she pulled up the freight registry and looked at the 17 ships again, and this time she looked at all of them, all of Station Meridian 7's commercial docking logs, and she did a calculation she should have done 11 hours ago. The 17 Terran freighters had requested specific berths that, if you mapped them spatially, formed a rough arc around the station's eastern docking quadrant. She extended the arc. She thought about what the arc was pointing at. "Oh," she said quietly to an empty room. She escalated the report, not to her supervisor, directly to High Executor Thanvoral's office, flagged critical, routed through emergency channels that were technically only authorized for imminent kinetic threats. By the time Thanvoral read it, Kale Oren had been flying the freighter Cairo Mercy for 6 hours on a heading that no agricultural hauler had any business traveling. Here was the thing Thanvoral had not known about human freight vessels. The Terran merchant fleet had been building its civilian cargo infrastructure for 80 years. In that time, the design philosophy of Terran shipbuilding had quietly evolved in a direction that no external observer had thought to analyze, because the changes were individually unremarkable. Larger fuel reserves than efficiency calculations required, redundant power routing architectures, hull plating that exceeded the structural requirements of cargo transit by a significant margin, navigation computing arrays that were, frankly, overspecified for the job of following established commercial corridors. These were not secrets. The specifications were in publicly available shipbuilding records, submitted annually to the Council's Trade Registration Office as required by the Meridian Accords. They were simply buried in 300,000 pages of commercial shipping documentation, surrounded by enough genuine agricultural tonnage and legitimate plumbing specifications to make looking for them an exercise in determined futility. Every single modification was independently justifiable. Larger fuel reserves extended range, which was commercially valuable. Redundant power routing improved reliability, which reduced costly breakdowns. Heavier hull plating extended vessel lifespan, which amortized construction costs. Better navigation computing improved transit efficiency. Taken individually, sensible engineering decisions. Taken as a whole, across 6,000 vessels, as a deliberate architectural standard implemented over 2 decades. They built a second fleet, Thanvorel said. The analyst who had been briefing him, a young Kalahari named Preservation of Record, who was having the worst morning of her professional life, said, very carefully, the more accurate framing, High Executor, is that they built civilian vessels that were never only civilian vessels. How long has this been planned? Based on the shipbuilding record analysis, the earliest coordinated design modifications appear in vessels commissioned approximately 22 years ago. 22 years. Thanvorel let that number sit in the room. The Council's Meridian Accords were 18 years old. The resolution confiscating Terran warships had been passed 3 weeks ago. The Accords, he said. Yes, High Executor. They began preparing for this before the Accords existed. Preservation of Record was quiet for a moment. Then, the human design philosophy appears to have been developed in response to an assessment of long-term political risk. Our analysts believe the Terran government identified, approximately 2 decades ago, the possibility that their naval capacity might someday be constrained by external governance mechanisms. The Freight Fleet Modification Program appears to be the result of that assessment. They saw us coming, Thanvorel said. They saw us coming 22 years before we voted. He stood up from his desk and walked to the observation window and looked out at the stars and thought about Ambassador Danton's voice. All right. Not defeat, not submission, not even resistance. The closing of one door and the quiet, unhurried opening of another. Where are they now? He asked. The freight vessels, where are they moving? That's the second issue, High Executor. Kale had been given the mission parameters in 11 minutes. That was the briefing, 11 minutes, a data chip, a set of coordinates, and Chief Ramos handing her a cup of coffee and saying, the Caro Mercy handles differently from what you're used to. She's heavier than she looks and she doesn't like fast turns, but the drive will surprise you. That's not really an intelligence briefing. It's the relevant parts of one. He paused. You know what you're going for. She did. She had understood the moment she saw the layout of that engine block. The Cathara relay. One of them. How many? Don't ask how many, Ramos said quietly. Ask only what you need to know for your piece. That was when she understood the full architecture of it, not a plan but a system, compartmentalized against exactly the kind of intelligence failure that would come when the Council eventually noticed. She didn't know who was going to Meridian 7, or the Yalith relay point, or wherever else the arcs were pointing. She knew the Caro Mercy and the Cathara approach vector and the 11-minute briefing. That was her world now. Who planned this? She asked. Ramos smiled, which on his face was a small and careful thing. People who read the Accords very carefully. People who noticed what the Accords said about warships and thought about what they didn't say about everything else. She had thought about that for 6 hours of transit, the Caro Mercy running quiet under an agricultural hauler's transponder signature, her manifest still listing 43,000 metric tons of soybeans. The thing about grief was that it had a weight to it. She had loved the asterisk resolute the way you loved a place that had made you who you were, the particular smell of her corridors, the specific rattle of the number 3 cooling fan that maintenance kept fixing, and she kept telling them not to bother because she could sleep by that rattle, and without it the silence was wrong. The council's boarding party had been professional and correct. They had given her 30 minutes to remove personal items. She had taken 20. She couldn't stay in the corridors longer than that. But the asterisk Carol Mercy was doing something to her, 6 hours in. The drive asterisk did surprise her. It hit the upper register of its output curve with a smoothness that had no business being in a freight vessel, and it held there with a stability that she recognized from military-grade systems. The hull's response to the minor gravitational gradient near the Cathara approach was wrong for a cargo ship in exactly the right ways. The navigation array anticipated her course corrections before she finished entering them. "You're not a freighter," she told the ship quietly to herself. Then louder she asked, "Chief, what do you actually need me to do at Cathara?" Ramos, who had been reviewing something on a secondary screen, said, "Block their long-range transmission array. Physical interdiction. Position the Mercy between the relay station and the primary antenna axis and hold there." "For how long?" "Long enough." "Long enough for what?" He looked at her steadily. "For the other pieces." The curiosity was almost physical, and she understood she was supposed to swallow it. She had been a military officer. She knew what compartmentalization meant. But there was a difference between accepting orders in a chain of command and sitting in a freighter that wasn't a freighter, running a mission she didn't fully understand, while the council presumably noticed that 17 ships on station Meridian 7 hadn't unloaded their soybeans. "Chief," she said, "what happens if we get this wrong?" He was quiet for longer than she liked. "We were always going to fight them," he said finally. "The question was whether it was going to be a fight we designed for or a fight they designed for us." He looked at his screen again. Humanity was never going to win a war the Council had time to prepare for. The only way we win is if they're still trying to figure out what the war is when it's already over. She turned back to her controls. The Cathara relay point was 4 hours ahead. 43,000 metric tons of soybeans trailed them in their sealed containers, real soybeans, because the manifests had to be real, because if a council inspector boarded them, the cargo had to be real. That was the detail that got her, finally, in the stomach. Not the engine retrofits or the military-grade navigation or the architectural cleverness of 2 decades of quiet preparation. The soybeans. Real soybeans. Because whoever designed this program had thought far enough ahead to understand that the cover only held if it was never a cover at all, if the freight vessels actually were asterisk freight vessels all the time except for this moment, except for right now, except for these 11 minutes and these coordinates and this very specific morning in this very specific year. They had carried real cargo for 2 decades. So that one day they could carry this. On station Meridian 7, a council security officer named Tactical Commander Bright Horizon watched 17 Terran freighters begin moving simultaneously and felt her threat assessment protocols engage so hard they almost crashed her cognitive array. She opened a channel. "All Terran vessels, this is Council Security Command. You are ordered to return to your berths immediately. Failure to comply will be treated as a hostile action under." The freighters didn't stop. They didn't fire anything. They didn't charge anything. They simply continued to move slow, ungainly, carrying their manifests and their legitimate cargo, positioning themselves with the unhurried deliberateness of vessels that had planned their geometry in advance. "What are they doing?" her second-in-command asked. She ran the arcs. She saw what the arc was pointing at. "They're blocking the enforcement fleet's docking approach. They're parking themselves between us and the anchorage." "Can we go around?" She calculated. The station's geometry didn't allow it, not without a transit time that would take hours. hours during which the enforcement fleet's rapid response capability was effectively zero. "I'm ordering a direct intercept," she said. "Move the—" "Commander," her second-in-command's voice was careful. "They're civilian vessels, unarmed civilian vessels with valid transit authorizations. If we fire on them—" Bright Horizon stopped. She stared at the 17 freighters, moving with ponderous patience toward the positions they had planned weeks in advance. Full of soybeans, flying civilian transponders, operated by crews who were technically just merchant sailors making a navigational adjustment that their transit licenses absolutely allowed. She could not fire on them, not without a hostile action she could formally identify, not without creating an incident that every one of the Council's 41 member species would have to respond to, an incident that would make the Terran confiscation look like a provocation rather than a measured governance action. The humans hadn't given her a target. "Open a channel," she said, jaw tight. "Get me the arbitration division. Get me High Executor Thanvoral. Get me—" "Commander, long-range communication is down." She looked at her sensor array. The Cathara relay, the Yalith relay, both of them showing degraded signal. Whoever was responsible for blocking those relays was either very good or had the laziest possible cover story imaginable. Both, she suspected. "They're not fighting us," her second-in-command said, very quietly as if nomming something enormous. "They're not fighting us at all." Thanvoral was already on the command channel, already dispatching enforcement units, already doing everything the protocols required, and already understanding, with the particular sick clarity of a person watching a lock tumble open from the wrong side, that the protocols were the problem. The Meridian Accords governed warships. They defined warship parameters, warship movement restrictions, warship impoundment procedures. They were extremely thorough on the subject of warships. They were thorough because the Council had spent 4 years drafting them specifically to address Terran military capability. 4 years spent on the right answer to the wrong question. "Where's Danton?" he asked. "Get me the human ambassador." His aide said, "Ambassador Danton is not responding to her comm. Her office reports she is in transit." "In transit where?" "Unknown." He pinched the bridge of his nasal ridge, a gesture his species used to center themselves when the world had become temporarily irrational. "What do we have that isn't blocked? What communications are still functioning?" "Local station relays only, High Executor. We can reach ships within the immediate system, but extra-system communication is." "Down, yes." He turned to his command display. "All right. What's the status of the impounded warships, the Terran military vessels at the anchorage?" "Still in custody, High Executor, fully secured, no change in status." Of course, because the Terran military vessels were not the point. The Terran military vessels were the gesture, the opened hand, the deliberate surrender of the obvious thing, the move that made you look at the empty hand while the other hand did something entirely different. "I need a full census," he said. "Every Terran freight vessel in Council space, every transit corridor, he stopped. He looked at his display. "How many?" His aide understood what he was asking. Registered Terran commercial freight vessels currently operating in Council space, 4,212. Thanvoral looked at that number for a long time. 4,212 vessels. Moving on commercial transponders, carrying legitimate cargo, obeying every commercial traffic regulation, filed with every required transit manifest. 4,000 vessels that the Accord said nothing about, that the enforcement protocols addressed nowhere, that his 41-member council had unanimously agreed to ignore because they were freighters. Each one with military-grade fuel reserves, military-grade power routing, military-grade hull plating and navigation systems, and, apparently, military-grade crews who had just simultaneously positioned themselves at every strategic choke point in Council space with the coordinated precision of an operation that had been planned for decades. They didn't build a second fleet, Thanvorel said slowly. His aide looked at him. They didn't build a second fleet in secret. They built it in public. They published the specifications. They flew the ships in front of us for 20 years. He exhaled. We had the data. We categorized it as commercial. We looked at every ship individually and never looked at them as a whole. The misunderstanding had not been about what humans were hiding. It had been about what they hadn't bothered to hide. Because they had understood for 20 years, that the most secure place to conceal a capability was inside a category that their adversary had already decided was irrelevant. "Get me any open channel," he said. "Anything, I need to reach Danton." Ambassador Sira Danton took Thanvorel's call from aboard the Terran freighter Persistence Asterisk, which was itself positioned. Entirely by commercial transit coincidence, she would later maintain with a straight face in the Council's primary administrative corridor. "Ambassador." His voice on the channel was controlled. It was the control of someone using enormous effort to appear unruffled. She had heard that particular texture before in negotiations. It was the control of someone who had just realized they were losing. "I would like to discuss the current situation." Of course, High Executor. She kept her own voice warm, professional, collaborative. "I'm always glad to speak with you. The freight vessels are operating entirely within their commercial transit authorizations. Yes. I can have our trade office forward you the relevant documentation if that would help." A beat of silence. "Sira," his voice shifted slightly, the formal title dropping, which meant the formal performance was dropping too. "That was interesting. What do you want?" She looked out the Persistence's forward view screen at the administrative corridor and all the ships in it. Freighters, haulers, salvage vessels, agricultural transports with 43,000 metric tons of soybeans. A fleet that had never been a fleet until the moment it needed to be. "Renegotiate the accords," she said. "All of them from the beginning." "We voted." "You voted on warships. We agreed to warships. We complied fully, High Executor, and I would like that compliance noted in the record. We gave you exactly what you asked for." She paused. "The trouble is that what you asked for was the wrong question. You spent 20 years preparing this. We spent 20 years preparing for the possibility of this. There's a difference." She leaned forward slightly. "We genuinely hoped it would never be necessary. We hoped the Council would treat humanity as a partner rather than a threat to be managed. We hoped the Accords would represent mutual governance rather than selective disarmament." She let that sit. "We prepared for the version of events where hope wasn't enough." Thanvorel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You would have launched this campaign regardless." "No," she said, and she meant it. "We would have stood down every single one of these ships the moment the Council demonstrated willingness to negotiate in good faith. We still will, right now, tonight. The Carol Mercy goes back to Cathara, the Meridian Fleet goes back to dock, every vessel returns to commercial operation." She met the camera. "But we need the vote reversed. All warships returned. And we need new accords. Ones that treat human security as a legitimate interest rather than a problem to be neutralized. The Council will not. The Council cannot reach a quorum," she said. "Not right now, not without communication relays." She said it gently, the way you inform someone of a fact that is already known. "So there's time to think, time to consider." She tilted her head. "We're not fighting you. We haven't fired a shot. We've moved some freighters around. It would be very easy to let that remain the entire scope of this disagreement." A longer silence. "You planned this for 20 years, Thanvorel said. "You built this, all of this, because you calculated that we would eventually vote to disarm you. We built it hoping we'd never be right." He exhaled, a sound that carried exhaustion in it and something else. something closer to the reluctant recalibration of a very long-held assumption. How did you know we wouldn't simply fire on the freighters? You were exposed. You relied on us being unwilling to create an incident. We relied on you being exactly as constrained by your own rules as we are by ours. She almost smiled. The Council is a governance body, high executor. Governance bodies cannot govern their way to legitimacy by shooting civilian cargo ships full of soybeans. You needed us to give you a target. We didn't give you one. That was the strategy, not the weapons or the positioning, the absence of a target. The absence of a target, she confirmed. Yes. He was quiet for a very long time. Then, in a voice that she would remember for the rest of her career, not angry, not defeated, but something rarer, something almost like the sound of a foundation shifting. I'm going to need to explain to 41 member species why we lost a strategic confrontation to people carrying soybeans. With respect, High Executor, you didn't lose. She let the pause land. You found out something important about humanity that you didn't know before. That has value. That should have value. We are trying to tell you who we are. She glanced out at the freighters, her fleet that had never announced itself as a fleet. We built all of this so you'd have to listen. So you'd have to ask the question of why we built it and sit with that question long enough to hear the answer. And the answer is, we don't build weapons because we want to fight, she said. We build contingencies because we refuse to be helpless. There's a difference. She sat back. Humans have a saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We've been hopping for the best for 60 years. We prepared for the worst for 20. She met the camera again. Now I'm hopping again. I'm genuinely, sincerely hopping that you'll see the value in sitting down with us. As partners. Kale received the stand-down signal 4 hours and 17 minutes into her transit to Cathara. She read it twice. She looked at Chief Ramos. Stand down, she said. Copy that. He was already adjusting their heading, back to commercial corridor. She watched the course line shift on her navigation display. The Caro Mercy swinging away from Cathara, resuming its entirely legitimate agricultural supply mission heading. She felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite disappointment, and was maybe the particular quiet that comes after you've held very still for a very long time. Chief, she stared at the changed course line. What if they'd just fired on the freighters anyway? What if they'd decided the incident was worth it? Ramos was quiet for a moment. Then we'd have fought them. In freighters. In freighters, he glanced at her. 4,000 of them with military-grade everything in every corridor simultaneously. He returned to his controls. It wouldn't have been a good war. It wouldn't have been a pretty war. He paused. We'd have won eventually, but it would have cost everything. She thought about that. About what everything meant. About the resolute asterisk sitting dark at an impound anchorage. About the specific rattle of a cooling fan she could no longer sleep to. About 30 minutes to gather personal items and 20 minutes used. Did they know that? She asked. The people who planned this. Did they know we might lose people, that it might go wrong? Yes, no hesitation. And they still built it. They built it so it would never have to be used. He checked his display. A weapon that can never be used is useless. A weapon that doesn't have to be used because the other side knows it exists. Is how you don't fight a war, she finished. The Caro Mercy ran on, carrying its 43,000 metric tons of soybeans back toward Caro Station, agricultural hauler, family-operated, 12 years of transit logs. She looked at her hands on the controls and thought about all the other hands on all the other controls in all the other freighters now running the same course corrections, same stand-down, same quiet return to the long fiction of commercial transit. Her comm pinged. A text message short, no header, routing through a civilian channel. Good work. Accord suspended, renegotiation scheduled. Come home. She stared at it for a long time. Come home. As if she had a home that wasn't impounded at a council anchorage. As if the resolute asterisk would be returned to her. as if the vote being reversed meant anything more than that the possibility remained open. But the asterisk Carol Mercy's asterisk drive hummed beneath her, smooth and military precise and strange in the way it hit the high register with that familiar steadiness. And for a moment she let herself put her palm flat against the console and feel the vibration of it. The ship that wasn't a ship, the fleet that had never announced itself, the 20 years of quiet preparation that had moved freighters into position, and then, just as importantly, had moved them back. Had stood down when asked. Had given the council something to negotiate with, because the plan had always been to avoid the war, and standing down when you could have continued was just as important as being capable of continuing. More important, it was the harder thing. It was the human thing. High Executor Than Vorel submitted his personal assessment to the Council's executive archive on the night of the stand-down. The document was 17 pages. The final section would become, in the years that followed, one of the most widely translated documents in Council diplomatic history. He wrote, "We have for 2 decades been asking the wrong question about humanity. We asked, how strong are they? We measured warships, armaments, active military deployment. These are rational metrics for assessing a species' threat capacity, and we applied them correctly. What we failed to measure was different. It was harder to quantify. It appeared in freight manifests and commercial specifications, and the particular way a human diplomatic officer says, 'all right,' when informed that her civilization's military has been confiscated. The question we failed to ask was not how strong they are, but how long they are willing to wait. Humanity built a contingency fleet across 22 years. They built it inside commercial infrastructure that we reviewed annually and categorized as irrelevant. They built it while maintaining full compliance with every treaty obligation, while continuing to negotiate in good faith, while expressing, through every available diplomatic channel, a preference for partnership over conflict. They built the contingency, and then spent 20 years hoping they would never need it. This is not the behavior of an aggressive species. This is the behavior of a species that has learned from its own history, from its own very considerable experience with conflict, that the civilizations that endure are not the ones that win the most wars. They are the ones that build the capacity to survive the wars they did not want, so that they never have to start the ones they would. We disarmed them. They waited. When the moment came, they moved 4,000 civilian vessels into every strategic position in Council space without firing a shot, without committing a single violation, without giving us a target. Then, when we opened a channel, they asked to talk. I am recommending full restoration of Terran naval assets, suspension of the Meridian Accords, and immediate initiation of renegotiation. I am also recommending that every member species intelligence division be required to review the full body of Terran commercial shipping data, not as a threat assessment exercise, but as a lesson in what it looks like when a civilization plays a 20-year game with the patience of something that has decided, at a fundamental level, that it is not going anywhere. We will be negotiating with them for a long time. We should understand who we are negotiating with. They are not the strongest species in this council. They may not be the oldest, or the most technologically refined, or the most strategically sophisticated by conventional measure. What they are is this. They are the species that built a fleet inside a fleet, hid it in plain sight for 2 decades, gave it to civilians, loaded it with real cargo and waited. Not because they wanted war. Because they had decided, somewhere in their long and violent and astonishing history, that the only way to ensure they would never be made helpless again was to ensure that even the version of themselves that looked most helpless was never entirely helpless at all. The Council should think carefully about what that tells us. Not about their military capability, about what they are willing to do, and more importantly, about what they are willing to keep waiting to not have to do. The Cairo Mercy docked at Cairo Station 4 days later. Cale Orange shut down the drive and sat in the silence for a moment. The absence of the hum she had learned to love in less than a week, the quiet of a ship at rest. Then she climbed out of the pilot's seat, walked down to the cargo bay, and looked at the sealed containers. 43,000 metric tons of soybeans. Real soybeans, which would now be unloaded and delivered because that was what happened when an agricultural freighter arrived at a colonial station. The manifest had always been real. Somewhere at a council-impound anchorage, the Resolute was waiting. She walked off the Cairo Mercy into the station air, which smelled like recycled atmosphere and machine oil and someone's lunch from 3 corridors over, and she pulled out her comm and read the stand-down message again. "Come home." Ramos fell into step beside her as they walked toward the processing terminal, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't much to say. They had moved a ship from one place to another. They had held a position for 6 hours. They had stood down when asked. That was all it had been from the outside. From the inside, it had been the particular feeling of having spent your whole career learning to fight, and then being handed a different kind of weapon, slower, heavier, less elegant, more patient. And discovering that patience was the thing nobody thought to account for, the variable that 22 years of council threat assessments had quietly omitted from every model, every projection, every unanimously endorsed resolution about what humanity was and what it could do. They hadn't calculated for patience. They hadn't calculated for the version of humanity that would rather carry soybeans for 20 years than give anyone a reason to call them the aggressor. A species that had fought enough wars to know that the most powerful thing you could ever do was build the capacity for war and then choose, every single day, not to use it and mean it, genuinely mean it, right up until the morning when meaning it was no longer an option. And even then, freighters, soybean, civilian transponders, no target. Even then, humanity had found the move that won without firing. Even then, they had looked for the way back to the table. High Executor Than Vorel would wonder, for the rest of his long career, what it meant that the most dangerous thing about humanity was not their weapons, or their endurance, or their famous irrational courage in the face of impossible odds. It was that they had built 22 years of contingency, planning specifically for the day they would need to come back and ask, one more time, to be treated as something other than a problem. And they had come back asking. Not demanding, not threatening. Asking with 4,000 freighters parked quietly at every choke point in the galaxy, full of soybeans, flying civilian transponders, going absolutely nowhere until